Welcome to our second video on how practically we trust God. Now, remember that trust bridges a gap that would otherwise exist between evidence and belief. In our last video, we looked at beliefs about the future. In this one, we're looking at beliefs about me. Our discussion question after the last video was, how have you seen God's goodness and power, His trustworthiness, in the past week? But maybe as you listened to other people talk, you thought, that's great for you, but I haven't seen God's trustworthiness in the past week. Or maybe you were thinking, look, I haven't seen God's trustworthiness for a much longer period of time. When we haven't been sensing God's trustworthiness or experiencing it, and other people are talking about how they have seen, sensed, experienced God's trustworthiness, it can be kind of painful. We feel like we're missing out. We might even feel like there's something wrong with us. And that's why we haven't been seeing God's trustworthiness in our lives. We'll get into that question of, is there something wrong with me, a bit more in week 6. But for right now, I'd just like to point out briefly that hearing about God's trustworthiness to others can actually be part of how we see God's trustworthiness. So you might have heard Christians talk about something called their testimony. Well, what does that mean? In court, to give testimony is to testify, and to testify is to bear witness. So what are Christians bearing witness to when they give their testimonies? Usually, they're bearing witness to God's trustworthiness. Often, hearing how God has been trustworthy to someone else can either just provide sort of direct, independent evidence that God is trustworthy, or it can actually help us see how God has been trustworthy to us. And that's especially true if the other person's life circumstances are similar to ours. So this is pretty intuitive in terms of how it works with, other Christians who are our friends or other people we meet in kind of everyday life. But we can also look to other people in the Bible and see how God's trustworthiness has been demonstrated to them. So here's an example. My sister has been working in a hospital with people who are dying. And because of COVID, these people are dying alone, without the comfort of family, without the comfort of friends. And sometimes pain like this just seems so senseless, so purposeless. We ask questions like, God, why couldn't this person have gotten sick just 6 months later when their daughter could have been with them? God, why can't this person have died just one lonely breath sooner? Why did they have to endure that last convulsive gasp, that last shuddering pain through their whole abdomen? And I do not know the answers to those questions. I can't even pretend or start to answer those questions. But there's a similar situation when it comes to Jesus' suffering. I don't know why Jesus' friends had to desert him, not just be prevented from being with him, but actively desert him at the time of his death. Why couldn't Roman soldiers have hit him just one time less? I have no idea why Jesus had to be crucified, which is an excruciating, torturous death, instead of just being beheaded. You can't breathe when you're hanging with your arms above your head. So crucified people actually usually die by suffocating when they lose the strength to pull themselves up on their cross to breathe. Why couldn't Jesus have died just one breath sooner? Why did he have to pull himself up by the nails through his palms one more time? Why did he have to scrape his shredded back along the rough wood plank on which he was mounted like a fish? I don't know. But I do know that if Jesus was God, then God would have avoided these things if they were not necessary. God would not have put himself through unnecessary suffering, unnecessary anguish, even if God was entirely selfish. So we have evidence that this type of thing does play some sort of necessary role in God's story, that there is some purpose to these things. If we claim to know what that purpose is, then I think we're totally kidding ourselves and we risk trivializing suffering. But I do think Jesus' suffering, some of which seems so senseless and purposeless, provides evidence that we can trust God, that our suffering does have a purpose, even if we don't see that purpose or can't even imagine it. So that's just one example of how we can see how God's trustworthiness in this horrible situation that Jesus went through can help us believe that God is trustworthy in horrible situations that we go through. So that Jesus is just one instance of how we can look to people in the Bible, we can relate to them, and then we can use their experience and God's trustworthiness to them to foster and nurture our own trust in God. So here are some questions that will help us think through this process of seeing God's trustworthiness to other people, in this case in the Bible, and then helping us trust God with ourselves, moving from evidence of God's trustworthiness to other people to belief that God is trustworthy for me. The first is just really simple. Who do you relate to? What person in the Bible went through a similar situation? And then the second question is, did that person see God's trustworthiness? What was the evidence that that person had of God's trustworthiness? Is there similar evidence in your life that you can look to see God's trustworthiness? That gets into that third question. If they did see God's trustworthiness, how? How did God show them his trustworthiness? And if not, if that person didn't see God's trustworthiness, if that person died in complete ignorance of any purpose, suffering, or redemptive value to their suffering, then I think it's helpful to ask, how do we know that God was trustworthy for that person, even though he or she didn't see it? What did they not have access to that we do have access to, that allows us to see that God was trustworthy for them, even though they couldn't? And these people who didn't see God's trustworthiness at the time, I think can be really, really helpful. Because sometimes when we aren't seeing God's trustworthiness, when we are feeling abandoned, ditched, like we hit the pavement hard when we were trusting God to catch us, realizing that other people have felt this way is actually one of the most reassuring things. Often when we read the Bible, we know things that the people who are being talked about in the Bible didn't know. We know the end of their story, but they obviously didn't. So it can be really helpful to realize that it's actually normal to not be able to see God's trustworthiness when we're in the middle of a sucky situation. And by understanding the gap between what those people in the Bible knew and then what we have access to because we can read the Bible, can help us then explore possibilities like, oh, maybe the fact that they couldn't see the end of the story, and that's why they didn't see God's trustworthiness, means that when I'm able to see the end of my story, then I will also see God's trustworthiness in my similarly sucky situation. So, in this video, we again asked, how do we trust God? And one way we can trust Him is by learning about His trustworthiness to others, be they other Christians we know or peoples whose stories are recorded in the Bible.